Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar brought to you by the UCLA Nazarian Center for Israel Studies, co-sponsored by UCLA's Political Science Department. I'm Dov Waxman, the director of the Nazarian Center and the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair of Israel Studies at UCLA. It's been 2 weeks since Israel's unprecedented fourth national election in 2 years. Like the previous 3 elections, this election also failed to produce a clear winner, and it seems unlikely to result in the formation of a stable government. Although caretaker Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been given the first opportunity to assemble a governing coalition, he may well fail, and a 5th election now seems increasingly likely. To make sense of all this and explain what's been happening in Israeli politics over the past 4 elections and the broader changes in Israel's political landscape, I'm delighted to introduce a leading expert on Israeli politics, Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin. Dahlia has a Ph.D. in political science from Tel Aviv University. She's a policy fellow at the Century Foundation and currently a visiting scholar at the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. She's a public opinion expert and political consultant who has advised and conducted research on no less than 8 national election campaigns in Israel. She also conducts the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian public opinion surveys together with the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research. And she co-hosts the Tel Aviv Review podcasts and co-hosts Haaretz's Election Overdose podcast. She'll give a presentation and then we'll do a Q&A. So please send us your questions. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dahlia.
Thank you so much, Dov, for the introduction. Thank you to everybody for joining. And thank you also to the Nazarian Center for having me as a visiting scholar, albeit remotely. I also am grateful for the opportunity to give a talk called Ideology, Policy, and Democracy, which allows us to go beyond the politics of politics that we have been witness to and we have sort of been force-fed, overdosed, whatever you want to call it, for the last 2 years of Israeli electoral cycles. The problem with having 4 election cycles in a row is that it's a major distraction from the policy issues that actually matter. And it even ironically gets us away from the deeper and long-term trends in Israeli society. The parties go into campaign mode, which means that they're mainly staking out positions on some national issues to compete with each other. And those national issues were on the agenda to some extent during this last campaign. I could say they included primarily issues related to the management of the corona crisis, specifically the issues of vaccines or the management of lockdowns and the death rate in Israel, alongside, of course, the economic crisis, which featured broadly in this Israeli campaign, where we are now, how to manage the future. To some extent, we saw discussions of foreign relations, primarily the changes in the Middle East and the Abraham Accords, and to a lesser extent, interestingly, issues of religion and state and the influence of ultra-Orthodox parties, and to an even lesser extent, questions about the fate of Israeli democracy and the future of the judiciary. But I would propose that almost all of these issues were essentially, they took a back seat and they were discussed only minimally, almost as a sideshow, primarily through election advertising, which very few Israelis actually watch anymore. And that the vast majority of the discourse, the commentary, and the news items about the election in this particular cycle focused on 2 other categories of content. And one of them was, what did Benjamin Netanyahu do today? Now, I know how hard it is to get away from that because I was preparing a weekly podcast trying to summarize the news, and the news agenda every week was primarily driven by Netanyahu. Notice that a number of the issues that I mentioned as national issues, such as the vaccines or foreign relations with Middle Eastern countries, are actually Benjamin Netanyahu issues. So it was very much a focus on him. Even the vigorous discussion and rather unusual conversation around the question of how Arab citizens of Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel would vote, was largely driven by the fact that Netanyahu took the lead on that issue in reaching out to him. So one category that took up most of the energy was Netanyahu, yes, no, what's he doing this week? The other major category, naturally, was, can we see a path to a government? And so much of the news commentary and news items focused on which party is doing what in terms of other parties. Are they boycotting each other? Are they swearing loyalty to one another? Are they signing vote sharing arrangements? Again, I call this the politics of politics, but it's not really focused on those national issues. All of this is natural, right? It's understandable. We know why we got here. But I think that this is why having 4 election cycles in 2 years, which focus on those issues more than policy issues, is bad for democracy because it distracts us from those other, really important issues. And so this lecture, I hope, will be my corrective in a way. I'm going to get my revenge on that situation by using the political analysis, which we must do to begin the discussion, in order to give us a framework and a jumping off point to understand what the results mean for the direction of Israel in terms of the ideology of the public, where are people oriented, how do we see that playing out in the recent elections, what that means for the issues on the national agenda, and what all of those mean for the fate, the future of Israeli democracy. Basically, I'm standing in to do what the Israeli political leaders should be doing, but they are not. So I hope that I can bring some clarity. Having said all of that, we have to start with the politics. So I will now share a presentation. So we are going to go through and look at the election results, based on coalition politics, ideology, historic context. We'll go through where we are, what the meaning of the election results are. Then I'll look at what is the meaning of ideology in Israel today? What are the issues that divide Israeli society, and how do they play out? What's the range of action on those core issues? And then we'll look at the impact on Israeli democracy, or I will try to give an initial assessment, and that will be basically the kickoff for the discussion that I hope follows. So to orient everybody around, where we are in terms of the elections, this is a big, crowded, messy slide full of information. And that, I think, is the most accurate reflection of the Israeli political scene today and the election results. This is the breakdown of parties based on 2 factors. At the top, okay, these are all the parties that got into Knesset, and we don't have to run through every single one, but I've organized them. You can see pretty much from the religious right through to the secular right-wing parties, through to the ideological right-wing parties, but those that have joined or have said they would join in the coalition looking for change, the non-Netanyahu bloc, through to the centrist parties, and then to the left-wing Jewish Zionist parties, and through to the parties representing Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel. This is Likud. But what I've done is try to group them by where they sit on the ideological spectrum. Okay, so by that logic, these 2 parties in the middle, Gidon Sa'ar's Likud breakaway called the New Hope Party, and Avigdor Lieberman's Yisrael Beitenu, are part of the right-wing bloc. Now, this gets obscured sometimes in the conversation about the Israeli elections because they had staked out their political campaigns on the idea that they would go into what is now being called the change bloc, those who wanted to form a coalition without Netanyahu. If you add these parties together, the religious parties, representing Ashkenazi and Sephardi, ultra-Orthodox communities, the National Religious Party, which is called Religious Zionism, it's actually the proteges of Meir Kahana and the very extreme ultra-nationalist, let's say even supremacist party, Naftali Bennett's party, and Likud. This whole bloc comes out to 72 seats, okay, out of 120 in Knesset. And the parties that categorize themselves either as centrist or on the left, including the Arab parties, come out to 48 seats. If you group them based on how they campaigned, those who were understood to be supporting Netanyahu in the coalition building process ahead of elections, you see that the breakdown is 59 seats for the at the time presumed Netanyahu coalition, and 61 seats for the parties that were presumed to be aligned in the non-Netanyahu coalition. But to complicate this further, after the elections were over and the results were in, all of those dynamics changed. And Netanyahu actually only had 52 seats worth of parties who agreed to go into a coalition with him and recommended him to the president to form the next government. 11 seats, 2 parties representing 11 seats who did not recommend either Netanyahu or the change bloc, which is essentially led by Yair Lapid. That is Naftali Bennett's party, this one with 7 seats, and Ra'am over here, the party representing the Islamic movement in Israel. Together they have 11 seats. That means the change bloc was left with 57 seats. And when you go, anyway, that all changed in terms of who actually recommended whom in the actual recommendations. We won't get into all those details. But this is to show you what has not changed. Okay, if you look at just the question of whether parties were pledging to go with Netanyahu or not, what you see is that there was not very much change in terms of the for or against Netanyahu dynamics. And by that I mean what the parties were saying they would do ahead of the elections. Okay, so in April of 2019, we saw that there were 60 seats even. It's a little bit of a different situation because we didn't know ahead of the elections that one of the right-wing parties, Avigdor Lieberman's party, would eventually decide not to go into the coalition with Netanyahu. So you could say there were 65 seats. Avigdor Lieberman had 5 seats. You could say that the right-wing and pro-Netanyahu bloc had 65 seats because we didn't know before the elections that 5 seats were going to pull away. But we did know that in September. We did know that in March a year ago, and we knew it now. And in each case, the electorate is fairly evenly split in for or against Netanyahu in terms of how the parties were presenting themselves. That is an argument for all of the many people who believe that these election phases have only been about whether they are for or against Netanyahu. No matter what happens in terms of which parties run and how they break themselves up or establish new parties, the public seems to break itself down in a pretty consistent way. You know, Netanyahu's loyal parties were not able to get a majority, and the non-Netanyahu parties or the Change Coalition or anti-Netanyahu had a small majority, but not enough to form the coalition in terms of how they were not able to get along with one another. Okay, that's where we have been for the last 4 cycles. But now if we go back to that axis in which I spoke about the ideological breakdown of parties, okay, the ideological right-wing parties versus the centrist plus left-wing parties. Let's look at this in historic perspective. Okay, and I know this is also messy, but Israel has lots of election cycles. I just took it back to 1977. Before 1977, we don't need to go further back. We know that Labor and its forerunner parties won the large plurality of seats. But if you go back to the first time that the right-wing parties and the religious parties, based on ideology, had a majority, we're looking at 1977, 61. Look at the range. We don't have to go through every single one, but the range is roughly 61 to 69 seats, with the peak of 69 seats in 2003 for the right-wing and religious parties, and all the others. It's a bit of shorthand to say centrist and left-wing, but that includes parties representing Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel. They tend to have fewer, which represents the reality of Israeli ideology, and I will show that in slides following this. The one exception was 2006, when Kadima, okay, was established and pulled seats and votes from both the right-wing religious bloc and from the center and the left, so they both dropped. But this was the entire range, and it never went above 69 seats until now, 72 seats. So this is another argument for the idea that the country is moving further to the right, that you have greater portion of people voting for right-wing parties than in the past. You can see relative to any time in 1977, which by implication means ever. But the reasons for that, I would argue, are not entirely because of a full-blown shift in public opinion and actual ideological positions, but rather because of the strategic calculation of many voters within the center bloc, and maybe even a few on the left, but primarily from the center, to support parties like Avigdor Lieberman or Gideon Sa'ar because they were right-wing, but breaking away from supporting Netanyahu. Why do I say that? That has to do with the next slide. Okay, I know this is a lot of information, but we can always go back over it with questions. What I'm trying to do here in shorthand is to, I do survey research in which I ask people to define themselves as right, moderate right, centrist, moderate left, or left wing. Some people always opt out and don't identify themselves, a small portion, usually about no more than 10%. And then I add together right plus moderate right, left plus moderate left. I add the left to the center because they have formed those opposition parties in the previous government, and in general, they were the basis of the anti-Netanyahu vote. And they have a lot in common. And in, just going back to April 2019, in the last survey I conducted for 972 magazine, just days before the election, the basic breakdown of people's self-identification in our survey was about 50% of the entire Israeli public. That means Jewish and Arab Palestinian citizens together. 50% right-wing. If you add all the centrists and left-wingers together, 41%, 9% who didn't identify. If you added up the real results by party, by percentage, not by Knesset seats, you got a very similar reflection of ideology. Almost 50% who voted for right-wing parties, 42% who voted for centrist and left-wing parties. So we see a pretty good reflection. Now, again, I'm not going to go through every single one, but you can see the trends. Again, in September, 51%, similar to the 50% right wing, 45% for center and left, not so, a little bit higher than the 41%. And that largely, those variations on the center and left block are largely about turnout among Arab Palestinian citizens, because they're the ones who have a high rate of non-identification in a survey, and they had higher voter turnout every election cycle after April. And then you see in March, we had a similar, again, fairly close representation, but just higher turnout, higher, slightly, both sides exceeded their self-identification, 54% for right-wing parties, 45% for left-wing parties. You'll notice these don't add up to 100% because we have parties that don't make it into, don't cross the threshold, and then their votes are wasted. But in March, we see where things changed, okay? And I just updated the surveys because, of course, April was almost 2 years, was really 2 years ago. But in, basing this on a survey that I conducted in August, which was the Israeli-Palestinian joint survey that I conduct, which Dov mentioned in the beginning. At this point, we had a total ideological self-definition of 52%, center plus left self-identification at 42%. Once again, you have a portion who don't identify, a rising portion, mostly driven by Palestinian Arab citizens responding to our surveys. But here the right-wing parties got 58%, or almost 59%, so close to 7% higher than their self-identification. Center and left parties got almost 40%, just 2% lower than their self-identification survey. Okay, the major change was about a 35% decline in the vote for the joint list from 2020, and combined the two seats together, the two parties together that ran in 2021. So that was driven, of course, by a major drop in turnout among Arab citizens of Israel, actually to a historic low. This is the lowest it's been, other than 2001 when there was an active boycott, and that was a special election. This is the lowest it's been since the end of the military government in 1966. And I think, as far as I remember, turnout was even higher before that, but it was not under a free system. So what we're seeing is that, we can say that people abandon their ideology just to vote for or against Netanyahu. But in fact, the percentage of people who voted, who diverged from their ideology is pretty small. Okay, from 42% to 40% among the left, just 2-point difference. From 52% to 59%, almost 7-point difference. That's the portion of people who moved away from their ideology because of the coalition building dynamics, presumably. So we still see a very powerful reflection of ideology in Israeli politics, and that's why we're thinking about where the country is going. Okay, now, what does ideology actually mean? Okay, it means many things. I mean, there are lots of issues that we can talk about. But in my analysis, based on where I see the deepest cleavages in survey research, and of course on policy discussions, there are 3 categories that really encapsulate almost all the issues in Israeli society, and that are the most divisive when it comes to looking at how people break down their ideological positions. So the first one, of course, is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In other words, when you look at the divisions between the differences between right-wingers, centrists, and left-wingers, this is the issue that is most polarizing. The center, by the way, thinks more like the left than the right on the big questions, and I'll show you some of the data on that. But when I say Israeli-Palestinian conflict, of course, I mean questions about peace and negotiations, questions about security, how hardline people are on security, how high it is on their priority list, the question of concessions, and of course, increasingly questions about annexation. The issue of religion and state, I place this as secondary to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because it is not quite as polarizing, interestingly, but it is more historic. It goes back to the founding of the state, long before there was an occupation, and even before the founding of the state. But that includes and encapsulates a number of other issues, including the politics of the ultra-Orthodox parties, whether they should be in or out of the coalition, the question about legislation around civil marriage, which we don't have in Israel, and family law in general, beyond just civil marriage, LGBT rights, which is an increasingly prominent issue in Israel over the years, gender equality and feminist issues, the question about what the country does on Sabbath, transportation, commerce, etc. Of course, this is overlapping with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the third major category, which is a newish, I say new-ish, issue on the Israeli agenda that increasingly is a polarizing divide between left, right, and center is the question of Israeli, I call it broadly Israeli institutions. It reflects on Israeli democracy, but it's really a matter of the judiciary. People are very polarized in Israel right now over the role of the judiciary, whether there should be constraints on the judiciary, and it all, I would say, ground zero of this discussion is attitudes towards the Supreme Court, which includes questions about the process for judicial appointment, who they are, whether they're conservative or liberal, the Judicial Appointment Committee, who sits on it, whether there should be more or fewer or more politicians, fewer or more legal figures. The question of whether there should be more executive control of the executive and the legislature, I should say, over other judicial roles, and broadly the question of judicial independence. This, of course, is deeply interconnected with the other three issues. These are not separate issues. They overlap to some extent, but they are the distinct categories that are most polarizing at this point, I would say, in terms of Israeli ideology. And just to give you some examples of this, again, there's lots of data here. We don't have to go through every single one, but I do want to illustrate why I make these characterizations. So here's a question of how Israelis break themselves down over the question of the two-state solution. Okay, I call this kind of, again, ground zero for understanding the divide over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is taken from the joint Israeli-Palestinian survey that I conduct with Khalil Shikaki. This was from September of 2020. The Israeli sample was 909 people. You don't have to go through all of that. But you can see that when we ask people about whether they support or oppose the establishment of a Palestinian state, which is known as the two-state solution, it's a slightly more detailed question than that, but this is what we call the general question without going into all the items. We see this breakdown: 44% support it, 42% oppose it, the rest don't know. But look at the left, 84% support it. That is essentially what defines left, right, and center in Israel. Among the center, as I mentioned before, they are more like the left. A majority, even if it's not as big a majority, support it. And on the right, we see basically the polar opposite, almost the exact opposite of the center, okay? And this is 64% who oppose the two-state solution. So ideologically, the right wing is ideologically opposed to the two-state solution, although this is very consistent. We see about 1/4 of the right-wingers, of course, that's higher between the moderate right and lower in the firm right, who do support it. All the rest, again, anybody, the missing numbers from 100% just means that some people don't have a position on this. Okay, this is why I say this is still the most polarizing issue, and why I also argue that even if the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not on the explicit agenda of the parties, even if the parties are not putting it in their political campaign messaging or in their ads, and we're not talking about negotiations and concessions or annexation, it is hovering over every Israeli voter's minds when they decide broadly whether they're going to vote for a right-wing party, a centrist, or a left-wing party. And then within those blocks, they make their specific decisions based on other factors, like whether they trust the leadership or economic concerns or whatever else. Settlements is the heart of the divide. I would say if you drill down into the two-state solution, this is as polarizing as the question of the two-state solution itself. This is from a slightly older survey from 2018 that was commissioned by B'Tselem, and you can see that we just asked a basic question: do you think settlements help or hurt Israeli security? But it doesn't matter how we ask the question about settlements, you get pretty much the same answer. All you need to do is skip around. The entire total is divided. Okay, Jews and Arab Palestinian citizens are very divided. A majority of Jews think they help, but not a huge majority. A majority of Arab Palestinian citizens think they hurt. On the firm right, a consensus believes that settlements are good for Israeli security. On the left, a consensus, 85% think they are bad for Israeli security. This is by 2015 Knesset vote. And once again, main thing I want to point out here is Likud supporters very much think settlements help. Yesh Atid, the centrist party that just came in second in the elections with 17 seats, a majority of them think settlements harm Israeli security, which is much closer to the broad trend of what was then Zionist Union, now was driven by the Labor Party. So this is basically the Labor Party. Similar trend among centrists and left-wingers on this issue. Okay, so the Israeli-Palestinian conflict still is the most polarizing issue when you look at ideological differences. Here's another question that was from a project I conducted, a survey I conducted in early 2018 for a project called Crossroads. And this is a question about, at the time, the trigger issue was a law that was passed basically saying that there cannot be small shops open on Saturdays in most Israeli cities. And we use that as an introduction to say, in general, this government at the time, the Netanyahu government that was led between that held between 2015 and 2019, and in general, this government is focused on strengthening the influence of Jewish religion in public life. Do you support or oppose that general direction? This was a question this is the result here broken down by the Jewish population and specifically broken down by ideology among the Jewish population. So here's why I say that religion and state is divisive, but not as divisive as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Because among all Jews, 62% oppose the general strengthening of Jewish religion in public life that this government is doing following the passage of this one law about the convenience stores on Saturdays. That's a stronger consensus. It certainly goes beyond the number of people who are either right, left-wing or centrist, right? Even combined, those were just over 40%. So this takes some of the right-wingers. And you can see quite clearly that among the moderate right wing, 72% opposed that trend, even among moderate right-wingers. Even the right wing, the firm right, is a little more evenly divided. 51% support that growing influence of religion in public life. That's not a big majority. And naturally, the center and the left show very similar trends, and they are almost uniformly opposed to the trend of increasing religious influence on public life. That's why this is among the most polarizing and among the most consistently polarizing issues in Israeli life. And we have many examples. There are many issue areas we can test on that relate to religion in public life. And increasingly, as I argued, the question of the Supreme Court is becoming a deeper and deeper division. Now, this is the Israeli Democracy Index conducted by the Israeli Democracy Institute, not my surveys. It's always good to balance your own sources with outside material. And it was originally in Hebrew, so I've translated it for you. But this is a simple question in levels of trust in the Supreme Court in Israel. And you can see that they've been testing this exact same question since 2003. There is some data before that, but it's very spotty. You can't actually track it in a clear way. And you can see that there were divisions based on ideology. If you look at the brown bar here is the left, the purple bar is the center, the green bar is the right, or I should say line. There were already divisions in 2003. And those divisions certainly date back to the Judicial Revolution in the early 90s in Israel, what we call the Judicial Revolution. It wasn't actually a revolution. It was just an evolution, I would say. But it was a change, and there has been an ideological divide. But you can see the numbers pretty much track each other. There's sort of consistent trends. They go up and down together over time. And then from around 2012, they start to really diverge. The support of the left wing, who trusts the court, remains pretty stable and very high at 84%, only 70%, but still very high among centrists. So similar trend to the left wingers. And among the right, support continues to decline, I would argue, following a very sort of vitriolic assault on the legitimacy of the Supreme Court and the judiciary at large by right-wing political leadership, driving down their levels of trust to just 38% in the most recent Israel Democracy Institute, Israel Democracy Index survey. So this is evidence of that the fact that this is becoming an increasing divide between left, right, and center. It was not really on the agenda in the past as a major dividing line, even though you can see the roots of it going way back. Okay, and this is another form of that question in which I asked back in 2018, again, a survey that I conducted for B'Tselem, do you have positive or negative views of the Supreme Court? This was a thermometer question, so testing more feelings, warm or cold feelings. And again, I show this mainly to affirm the previous slide showing the ideological divide, but also to indicate that there were considerable differences between the firm right and the moderate right. 42% showed positive views on the moderate right, only 25% among the firm right, and corresponding negative views. Also, yeah, this star got moved. It was actually supposed to be emphasizing the younger group, because here you see that among younger Jewish Israelis, only 30% showed positive views of the court, 38% showed negative views at the time. Younger people tend to be more right-wing and hardline, and you can see that in the older age groups, you see a majority who support it, and major differences, of course, by levels of religious observance among Jews. Among secular people, 2/3 show positive views of the court, Masorti means traditional. It's people who are somewhat religious, but not very religious. This is what we call the national religious, or Americans call modern Orthodox community, and ultra-Orthodox Haredi. Here's where we see a real drop-off and much stronger antipathy or negative feelings towards the Supreme Court. For a total in the Jewish Israeli population in this survey of only 48%, not even a majority at that time, who had positive feelings towards the court. So this is a very deep ideological divide. One more thing I throw in for color, because I often get asked, what about normal issues like the economy? Well, the interesting thing about the economy in Israel is that it's a longer conversation about why, but Israelis over time, and this is research again from the Israel Democracy Institute, a great paper worth reading, it's only in Hebrew, but it shows that while there may be some gaps in how Israelis view their overall perspective, whether they support a capitalist approach or a socialist approach, which used to be how we ask the question in Israel. There are gaps between left, right, and center, but the overall trend is that in 1969, which is when this study tried to go back to, already still a majority of right-wingers said that they support a socialist approach, and a majority of all other ideological groups. And in 2009, not too much had changed. A majority at least said that they support a socialist approach, which is ironic considering the direction of the country. But the fact is, Israelis are not really looking at this very deeply or very closely, and there is not a great difference in the overall trend between right, left, and center, self-defined right, left, and center Israelis in terms of how they view the economy. Which is why when parties run campaigns on issues related to the economy, which some people tried to do, Naftali Bennett's party ran primarily on a platform of an economic policy. There was a new party that tried to run just as an economic party. Naftali Bennett did far worse than his worst expectations in this election, and worse than most polls showed. And the small party running on an economic platform, a new party, didn't cross the threshold. Israelis don't divide themselves based on economic issues. So now that we know how the society is divided and we know what they're divided about, I want to reach the end of my talk by trying to envision what the range of policy actions are and what kind of impact they might have on Israeli democracy. And I'm going to base it on those three categories. Now, this is to some extent speculation, but it's speculation based on what we've been seeing debated in terms of those policy issues over the last couple of years and what's been on the agenda in Israel. So these are scenarios, but they're scenarios based on actual developments that we've seen in the recent Knesset cycles. So first, on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I list these basically from starting with the hard line to the more moderate positions that we can expect under the likely governments that might be produced following this election. Well, the more hardline approach is that there will be more settlement expansion. There will be more creeping forms of de facto annexation on the ground. And maybe even if the religious Zionist party becomes a part of the next government and Naftali Bennett is part of a right-wing government led by Netanyahu, maybe they will even revive the question of passing legislation or a policy explicitly declaring annexation, which has its risks, and who knows if it'll happen, but it is certainly on the agenda. It was just on the agenda a year ago. A more moderate position is that annexationist moves will be reined in somehow, but there will be no real change in settlement status. An even more moderate position would be some minimal measure of restraint on settlement expansion, such as a freeze, things that have happened in the past. If there's even a more moderate centrist-led, let's say a centrist-led government, we might see a revived government commitment to a two-state solution in rhetoric, and maybe even one-day negotiations. But I would say the chances look pretty unlikely, at least anytime soon. Now, I hope I don't have to take a long tangent, but I'm happy to discuss it in the questions. The impact on democracy of an unresolved conflict is negative. The occupation is the least democratic part of Israeli society. It is the reason why some people think Israel is not democratic in general, because of this ongoing situation of governing a population which does not have the right to vote, which has become increasingly permanent. Religion and state, what are the hard line to moderate positions? I'm sorry to say that the religious Zionist party, which has just gotten into Knesset, had a platform which they have since taken down from being published on the internet, which was very extreme. It is basically a theocratic, ultra-conservative party. They would prefer to have basically a messianic run state on some level. And we're talking primarily about rolling back. I think the most immediate issue that would affect everybody's life is rolling back gender equality. Their platform took very regressive positions on that issue. It may be one of the reasons they took it down, because they were getting heavy criticism of it. Naturally, this overlaps with an anti-LGBT agenda, ultra-conservative, of course. But basically anything that was moving in a progressive direction on these issues, they would try to roll back, no question. That would be the most extreme thing that could happen. There are laws under question right now. The issue of whether there would be more transportation on Shabbat based on law or shopping on commerce on Saturdays. Some of these laws could be upheld or repealed or revised, but the idea is that this is the arena that could change and could become either more restrictive or less restrictive based on what kind of government we have. Of course, the hot button issue that touched off, at least theoretically, this entire cycle of elections was the question of drafting the ultra-Orthodox. To be honest, if we have a very right-wing government, I expect very little change. They will, of course, be dependent on the 16 seats of the ultra-Orthodox parties. And even if there's a centrist-led government, even if it's led by Yair Lapid with Avigdor Lieberman, and this was his signature issue, we know the history of Israeli politics. It will be a slow, incremental change. I can't see any scenario in which there is a sweeping draft law in Israel to draft Haredim. And the question of civil marriage and family law, if there is a centrist-led government, it will include right-wing parties, but maybe if there are secular right-wing parties, there will be some progress on that issue. That will be a change. But I think in terms of the impact on democracy, if we're looking at a far-right government, right, if Netanyahu has his way and he can establish the government with the religious Zionist party and Naftali Bennett's party, it will not be good for civil rights or gender equality or progressive values, which are all part of how we look at liberal democracy. If there is what they call the Change Coalition, led by some constellation of Yair Lapid, Gidon Sar, maybe Naftali Bennett, hard to know, they could make some progress, I would say, primarily on the issues of family law and maybe what happens on Sabbath. Now, in terms of, and I'm ending with the final issue purposely, because I think this is where we're seeing the most vigorous and aggressive debate between the parties right now, even though they have not been sufficiently vocal and clear in my mind on the campaign trail. But I'm basing this list of the most hardline to the most moderate positions on issues that are already under debate, policies that are under debate, bills that have been proposed. The most obvious one, and this of course overlaps with another elephant in the room we haven't discussed, which is Netanyahu's corruption trial. We can maybe talk about it in the questions. The most extreme version would say there is a right-wing government. They will move to pass an override law, giving the Knesset the power to override a Supreme Court ruling. They can change the Judicial Appointment Committee, something that has been under discussion for a very long time and is a very real policy that I think that many of the right-wing parties would like to advance, giving more political control. That means control of the executive and the legislature over the Judicial Appointment Committee, and naturally appointing more judges trying to appoint more judges with conservative views. There is talk, these are not so much specific bills yet, but I think in the legal circles on the right wing, there is a lot of discussion about how to restrain or restrict judicial review altogether, basically to cancel the power of the court to rule that a legislation is unconstitutional, restrain universal standing and widespread justiciability, which is, these are maybe more technical issues than we have time for now, but they will severely undercut the independence of the Supreme Court and the accessibility of the Supreme Court. Remember, we're talking about a country that does not have a written constitution. There have been bills to legislate that legal advisors to the government ministries would be political appointments rather than professional appointments. Again, technical, but these would have a major impact, all the way through to extreme interpretations of the nation state law, which if people aren't familiar with it, again, I would say leave it for the questions, but this is a law that essentially privileges the Jewish citizens of Israel over everybody else. It is very open to interpretation how much it will actually influence Israeli society, and a far right-wing government, along with a more conservative and less independent court, could give extreme nationalist interpretations to that. Or if there is a more moderate government, they could do the opposite. Basically, interpret this in ways that are not very meaningful and possibly revise or add an equality clause or even repeal the nation state law, which is a more extreme version, but it could happen if there is a change coalition. I don't expect anybody to actually repeal it. And the question for democracy, what's the impact of this stuff? I think we're going to see if there's, a very right-wing government, we will see more, really, I think, more significant and severe constraints on the independence of the judiciary at large. If there is a change government, change coalition, there will be probably some reforms, because parties on the right who are part of the change coalition sort of give credibility to the criticism of the judiciary and say we support reforms. But in the same breath, the slogan that they like to say is that we won't take a D9 to the Supreme Court. We won't try to bulldoze the Supreme Court. I hope that's true. These are all possible scenarios. I don't know how likely any of them are until we have a government. I'm not going to try to answer that question right now. I would say the 5th election is a wash. Let's meet ahead of the 6th election.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that very detailed and thorough analysis. And also for, I don't think you mentioned the name Netanyahu that many times. And I think, certainly—
I was trying to be refreshing.
It is certainly refreshing, because I think over here in the United States and maybe around the world, there's a tendency to focus almost exclusively on Netanyahu and to see Israeli politics as just revolving around Netanyahu, in a way that many people saw American politics as revolving around Donald Trump when he was president, and he just kind of takes all of that oxygen. And I think what you showed very well is that, there's a lot more to Israeli politics and to the Israeli political landscape than just position attitudes towards Netanyahu and occasion of Israeli politics, just to reduce it into, pro-Bibi or anti-Bibi, right? So I wanted to and before I ask you some questions, I want to remind our members of the audience, we have plenty of time for questions, so please send us your questions. I will be reading them and selecting questions, so please send us your questions. But let me begin then with this, this issue of Netanyahu, because there has been this narrative, at least made by journalists over the last 4 elections, that each election is really devoid of substance. There aren't really issues at stake. It's all about whether Israelis were for or against Netanyahu. What you seem to be arguing is that really that wasn't really the case, that this idea that Israeli politics has become divided into just, anyone but Bibi or only Bibi is actually not accurate. So if that's the case, if it's actually behind that, these, the continued salience of ideological divisions and substantive issues, why then has this Bibi narrative, become so focused? Is this just lazy journalism? Or is it because, as you said, in these election campaigns, people have tended to focus on Netanyahu and kind of really the issues haven't got that much coverage? Why do you think Netanyahu has become this kind of totemic figure almost?
So my first comment would be that I think it's not so much lazy journalism, but it is lazy punditry to blame journalists for everything. So I try not to do that. And I do think that we can't dismiss the importance of Netanyahu. The reason why that's become such a compelling narrative is because Netanyahu is a very successful politician, and he's made it all about Netanyahu. That is exactly where his skills lie. He has, this, and I think this is a classic kind of success for a populist leader and leader who governs through populist rhetoric and campaign and strategy, is to make everything that happens in the state seem like it's about him, to fuse himself with the state, to fuse his victimization with the victimization of constituencies within the state, to fuse his triumph and victory as the victory of the aggrieved and marginalized populations. That is what the populist does best. And he's very good at that. He's incredibly skilled at it. So, first of all, when you're in power for 12 years, you have the greatest influence. You have the easiest access to the biggest, platforms in the country. And you have the greatest opportunity to demonstrate what you can do. You can manage foreign relations. You can manage security policy. So of course, everything that, most things that happen in Israel, he either can legitimately claim he did, or he can make it seem that it's what he did. And I think that both are the case. There are some areas where he is responsible. I mean, I don't think anybody in Israel disputes that he was responsible for acting early and effectively on bringing vaccines, for example. Just an example, no dispute about that. But we can dispute whether Netanyahu is really the one, for example, who pioneered the legitimization of bringing an Arab party into the coalition. There, I would say, it's lazy thinking. It's inertia in believing that Netanyahu is the reason for everything that happens in Israel, when in fact, the question about Jewish-Arab political partnership goes back, I would say, at least to Ayman Odeh's political program, beginning when he established the Joint List or became the leader of the Joint List in 2015, straight through to the breakthrough moments during the earlier campaigns in 2019 and 2020, when there was talk of forming a coalition with the Joint List, and Ayman Odeh recommended Benny Gantz to be prime minister. These are things that all contributed to breaking down earlier taboos on Jewish-Arab partnership, but Netanyahu comes in and takes credit for it and certainly drives it forward. I mean, all of these things are happening at the same time. So he gets the credit because suddenly the mainstream media takes notice of it, and his supporters and right-wingers take notice of it. But I think that it becomes flattening to say that it's only about him. So I don't want to dismiss, how large he looms over what Israeli society is right now. But if you actually break down his policies, also, many of them are essentially continuity with earlier policies. And I include within that where he stands on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It doesn't take more than a basic reading of the post-1967 era, and I can highly recommend my colleague Gershom Gorenberg's book, The Accidental Empire, to look at the sources of the settlement program, and how Israel became so entrenched in controlling the West Bank and Gaza by establishing settlements under labor governments and with the knowledge and, in many ways, support of labor governments, without quite declaring which way they were going, this way or that. Well, that's very much like Netanyahu. He doesn't declare exactly what he sees as the future of this region, other than this kind of year-long ploy. I think it was basically a ploy with annexation. But essentially, he lets things kind of take their course. He doesn't declare anything. He leaves it ambiguous, except for 12 years ago, talking about some truncated version of a two-state solution, and then kind of tolerating this version of the Trump plan that came along. But it was all very murky, while on the ground, the developments are happening quietly, incrementally every day. That is very much a continuation. And so that's just another example in which I think Netanyahu is seen as the person driving everything, but in many ways his policies are continuation. Of course, he has bombastic media rhetoric. He's great at generating very clear and distilled, vision, kind of characterizations of Israeli society. Very much, again, consistent with populist narratives of who's right, who's wrong, binary divisions, who's in, who's out, who's an existential threat and who's on our side, who's the enemy without and the enemy within. He's very good at that. And so he overshadows our thinking about it. But I would argue that many of these issues are continuations, or were, ideas were advanced with the input of many other actors.
Yeah, it seems, I don't want to harp on attacking journalists, but it seems that part of this is the preference in journalism and the media for kind of focusing on personalities rather than issues, right? It's easier to dramatize political conflicts. So, in recent weeks, even before the election, certainly since the election, the focus has been on, what does Naftali Bennett feel toward Netanyahu, and what does Netanyahu feel towards Gideon Saar, example, etc., rather than what's the position of their voters and what are the ideologies of their voters, which ultimately may tell us more about which way these individuals are going to go, rather than their own personal feelings. There's this kind of focus on personality politics. And I think one of the great things you've done in your analysis is shifted our attention actually to the real issues and not just this kind of melodrama of personalities. In a way, what I'm hearing you saying is that fundamentally, and correct me if I'm wrong, there hasn't been a realignment of Israeli politics, that the fundamental kind of tectonic plates, right, left, structured largely in terms of attitudes towards the occupied territories, specifically toward the future of the West Bank and settlement building, that fundamental alignment, that shaped Israeli politics for decades, continues to be fundamentally what shapes the Israeli political landscape. And nothing else, has really been able to realign Israeli politics, despite, there was a discussion some years ago that the divisions over religion and state would become the new dividing line in Israeli politics. Or for a brief moment after the so-called, tent protests, after the protest movement that emerged in Israel about socioeconomic conditions, that maybe there'll be a new alignment over socioeconomic issues. And then more recently, maybe there'll be a new alignment over democracy and over the Supreme Court in particular. None of those realignments have really seemed to kind of take hold. And the persistent one underlying this, according to your analysis, is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So why do you think, maybe the answer to this is kind of blindingly obvious, but why has this issue continued to be the mother of all issues? Why has Israeli politics, despite all of these campaigns and political consultants trying to create a new division in Israeli politics, they persistently have been unable to ultimately reshape the Israeli political landscape?
You can't ask that many internal questions in one statement and expect me to answer only the last one. So, I'm going to try to unpack, because it's a very rich kind of set of ideas there. I think that the one thing I'm going to try to clarify about Netanyahu, when you said, was there a realignment, and you interpreted me, I think rightly so, as saying that there's not really an ideological realignment. But I do think that ultimately we saw the electoral results. 72 seats is the greatest number of right-wing seats in Knesset we've ever seen. And so I think what happened was that the public hasn't realigned itself ideologically per se. There has been a rightward drift over the years, pretty much since the Second Intifada, and even going back before that. So we need to take that into account. It's been a slow, incremental increase for various reasons, some to do with circumstances, some to do with demography, to the point where we now have 50 or over 50% of the population who consider themselves right-wing. But that has not realigned over the last 2 years. However, I think what Netanyahu did, ironically, was he split the right in terms of political elites. The right wing among political elites split for or against him, with two significant parties. Between the two of them, they have 7 and 6, 13 seats, leaving Netanyahu because of him. And as a result, they split the voters on the center and the left. So even though ideology didn't align, some of the centrists voted for them, and that brought us to a situation where even if the public hasn't truly realigned, we now have the most right-wing Knesset in history, and we're going to have to face the consequences of that. And as if everybody knows in Israel, if Netanyahu were to step down tomorrow, okay, I'm going to take you out of suspense. This is not going to happen. But if he were to step down tomorrow, we would have a 72-seat coalition tomorrow or the next day. And that's where the country would go. And all of those most hardline scenarios that I mentioned before would happen without much resistance. So that is the reality. It's the interaction between people and political leadership, between elites and the public. Now, to your question about why society has not realigned, I also want to argue that if Israeli politics was based fundamentally on the public's position on those 3 issue categories, there are 2 categories in which you would see a majority going towards the center left side. Religion and state, where, as I showed you in the slides, a majority prefer more secular state, less interference of religion. And on the judiciary, where we still have a plurality, and depending on the question, often a majority, who would prefer to support the independence of the judiciary and strengthen the balance of powers. And it's really the Israeli-Palestinian issue where we have greater percentage of right-wing, and that is the most polarizing issue. So if Israeli politics was a perfect reflection only of issue positions, 2 out of 3 would give us a more center and left-leaning country, but that's not the case. Why is the Israeli-Palestinian issue, why does it continue to be the most dominant, the most polarizing? I think it encompasses all the others. It's a reflection of religious vision, okay, there are seculars who are security hawks, but still the project of expanding Israel's control and deepening Israel's control and making it permanent over the West Bank and continuing to control, if not enter Gaza, is largely, it's the ideological driver is religious. It is the implementation of a religious agenda. So it subsumes that. And in terms of the question of the judiciary, I just want to go back to a point that I made maybe a little too quickly in passing. The judiciary is the key for the right wing to be able to continue that process. In order to continue expanding and making permanent Israel's control over the West Bank and precluding the idea of a Palestinian state ever coming into being, you need to weaken the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is maybe not the best, but certainly the only real institutional basis for protesting those claims at present within the region. Okay, I'm leaving out international pressure and sanctions and International Criminal Court, but within Israel, that is the forum where you can have dissent, where civil society actors can go and argue cases, where Palestinians who are not citizens can have their cases argued. The more you weaken the Supreme Court, the more you enable the implementation. So all of those things are put to the service of this bigger agenda. And of course, that bigger agenda will subsume them. So I'm not sure if I'm really saying, clarifying, making this, into a perfect, neat package. But I think that people's vision about what Israel should be, in terms of should it be all of the land and where Jews dominate, is more important to people, and they will subsume the other two to the service of that vision.
I think one of the things that's striking from what you're saying is that Israelis today have perhaps the most right-wing Knesset, the Knesset members that took the oath of office yesterday, they're members of the 24th Knesset, is probably the most right-wing Knesset in Israel's history, with 72 Knesset members who are ideologically on the right. Mm-hmm. And yet, and if they were able to somehow form a government, if Netanyahu wasn't on the scene, you would have maybe the most right-wing government putting into place policies that would be unprecedented in some respects. And yet, Israeli voters themselves do not actually hold these views, right? So they might end up with a very right-wing government enacting very, very right-wing policies, despite the fact that their own views on these issues of Israeli voters is actually at least more to the center, which is kind of a stranger outcome, I suppose. We've had some questions about digging into, why there is this rightward shift, and in particular, I think a few members of the audience have asked about this, about young Israelis, because when we think about young people in general, the kind of cliche of young people is that they're idealistic, they're hopeful, and therefore they tend to be more liberal. And
why is it a cliche? I was like that.
Right, maybe, and some people say, over time people may drift toward the center or even go toward the right, but at least young people tend to be liberal or on the left, and that's certainly true of young people in the United States. But in Israel, as you showed in those surveys, young people are actually more likely to be right-wing. Why is that? Why do you think young Israeli Jews, I should say, are more likely to be so much more right-wing than older generations of Israel?
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, it is a combination of, all of these overlapping issues. I mean, the combination is that, I think that particularly following the Second Intifada, there was a generation of young people who grew up in circumstances that were conducive to right-wing attitudes. Among them, the Israeli-shaped and driven narrative that it was all the Palestinians' fault, the peace process collapsed only because of the Palestinians, which is something that the political leadership of what was then considered left, in quotation marks, Ehud Barak, and certainly to the right, which is repeated endlessly across the board in Israel. The circumstances of remembering the violence, the fact that there is anything like a peace process on the agenda, to the extent that there have been negotiations, they've been so lackluster that nobody expected them to produce anything. And they weren't even really very front and center on the agenda to the extent that they have happened. The fact that young people have grown up in the Netanyahu era, which has ushered in a particular form of particularly virulent nationalist populist discourse, in which it is both wrong to be left-wing, even before you get into what that means. And increasingly, I think that increasingly relative, let's say, to the 1980s or 90s, the idea that it is generally understood, whether you're religious or not, that there is an integrity to the whole land of Israel and it must not be divided. The territories are called Judea and Samaria normally, not just by firm right-wingers. It's a change since I moved to the region in the 1990s. that's one aspect of it. So the historic circumstances in which those young people have grown up. But the other reason is demographic, because one thing I didn't get into here is that there is a very strong, I call it the iron law of Israeli polling, a very strong correlation between how religiously observant Jewish Israelis are and how right-wing they are. Okay, there is a segment of secular right-wingers, but they are largely, not exclusively, but they are largely former Soviet immigrants. But certainly the more right-wing, the more religious Jewish Israelis are, the more right-wing they are. Just to give you some numbers, among the national religious population, about 95% identify as either firm or moderate right. A small percentage identify as centrist, and in my surveys, 0%. Like, certainly tiny decimal points identify as left-wing. And among traditionalists, by the way, people who consider themselves religiously traditional, over about 3/4 identify, or 70% up to 3/4 identify as right-wing. And among seculars, okay, people who are firmly secular, we have over 30% who consider themselves left-wing. When you add the centrists, they have a majority, over 60%. So it's really, completely differing visions of the world. And as we know, the religious populations in Israel have higher birth rate, so they have more people populating the younger cohorts, and so they're more right-wing. That is sort of the chain of connections. But it is a combination. And the other interesting thing is that I've been doing some research lately into historic public opinion data, and I'm seeing in some of the public opinion research that was conducted even as early as the 1950s and 60s, that young people took more hardline positions. How to explain it going back that far? I call it a sort of romanticized nationalism that has driven the ideology that you speak of, that young people, when you say young people tend to be more ideological, in Israel, that took the form of being ideologically nationalist. And so I think if I had to guess, it's speculation. That's how I would explain it in the past. And in the present, I know more because I've done much more in-depth research trying to understand the sources of those views. But it is a sharp contrast to most Western democracies, certainly liberal democracies, which, it's questionable whether we should be doing that comparison. But certainly in the US, young people, very consistently express more, liberal, left-wing views on a range of issues.
So given the fact that, as you've shown, Jewish Israelis tend toward the right, and younger Jewish Israelis are even more right-wing, many analysts and commentators have argued recently, that the only way for the left in Israel to revive its political fortunes, its only hope of forming a government, is through a cooperation or even combination with Arab parties, and we're bringing in the Arab citizens. That's the only way that the left will, be able to form a majority. Do you see that? First of all, do you agree with that analysis that is what will be necessary? And do you see the shift that's taking place now? Then you mentioned that Netanyahu is certainly not solely responsible for the increasing willingness to consider Arab parties as potential coalition partners, or at least as outside supporters. Do you think the conditions are changing such as to make that kind of Arab-Jewish cooperation increasingly possible? Mm-hmm. Or, this is my final question I'll ask, mm-hmm. Do we see what's happened just in the last couple of days? The fact that Netanyahu once again has been given the nod because somebody like Gideon Saar, for example, wasn't willing to back a centre-left or Lapid-led or Bennett-led government that might include an Arab party or Arab support. Does it show that all of this talk about Arab parties becoming newly kosher is actually at best premature?
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm one of those people who have been arguing for Arab parties to be in the coalition. I would say starting a decade ago, I wrote my first article about that. Not because I think it's the route to a revival of the left in Israel, but because I think it's the right thing to do in a democracy. Minorities should have presence in the executive. There's never been an independent Arab party in the coalition in Israel. So let me just explain that. My personal starting point is that it's not just really, to my mind, again, I'm going to get, this is my distinguishing my personal analysis from where I think Israeli society is. I don't really think the question should be how to revive the political fortunes of the left in Israel. I think the left in Israel was extremely flawed to begin with, had a lot of internal contradictions, and I think those internal contradictions contributed to the problematic electoral situation of what is considered to be the Zionist left in Israel. And I think that the question about how to revive their political fortunes is probably going to lead to political disaster, because it's really just a matter of political strategy. The question is, what do they stand for? And so what does it mean to be left-wing in Israel, or anywhere? I mean, I think that if you try to understand, think of this as some combination of economic, social, and on the national questions, of course, Arab political partnership should define the left in Israel, because that should be what they stand for, universal values, equality of all citizens. I mean, that's what they say they stand for. The only way to express that is to have that kind of partnership. Whether it will help them get into office, I doubt it, but I think that the question is how to legitimize that so that it's not dependent on the fortunes of parties that, are not going to have great political traction anytime soon, but how it becomes mainstream, that there should be an assumption that the Arab Palestinian minority in Israel needs to have representation and needs to be in the executive power. It should be a given in a democracy and liberal democracies. Now, has Netanyahu really contributed to that? I want to reinforce what I said before. I don't think he gets the credit from the start. That was driven by, Ayman Odeh and the project of the Joint List and the program of Jewish-Arab partnership. There was some traction from civil society organizations who tried to support that. Not enough, I think, uptake from some uptake, I would say, from the Jewish Zionist left-wing parties, Labor and Meretz. Some, but maybe not consciously enough, and a little bit defensive too, if you look at what happened in this election campaign in terms of the Palestinian Israeli citizen who was 7th on the list in the Labor Party, and there was some criticism from the right, which was predictable, and the Labor Party got all paralyzed. So it's hard for them. I don't know why that, I think that they could make that a stronger part of their political program. And to be honest, I'm seeing in my surveys, and there have been public surveys, including just one that came out the other day from the Israel Democracy Institute, showing a really striking rise in support or acceptability of the idea of an Arab party going into the coalition in Israel among the total population, among the Jewish population, but that rise is being driven by the right and the center, because left-wingers already supported it. And that is a change that's happened in recent months. Again, it's been confirmed in several public surveys and in my own surveys. There's very little question about it. And that, of course, is driven by Netanyahu, because the right wing wouldn't change their mind because left-wing parties or Palestinian citizens of Israel say it. So there is a change in the public. And I think the real question now is whether the elites capitalize on that change and make it happen and realize the potential. But of course, the right-wing political elites in Israel don't have any real interest in advancing that case. And then it's up to the center parties, Yair Lapid, you could say, well, he would do it, I suppose. He said he would do it, which was a radical change from his previous position. It doesn't seem like he's going to be given the chance to do it. So I think that you're very correct to question whether this is a genuine change or just a sort of momentary, opportunity that passes. If the opportunity was, leveraged now, it could make a real change in legitimizing genuine political participation and control, influence, actually, of having an Arab-Palestinian party in the Israeli coalition. But I have a feeling, based on what we're seeing over the last few days, that it's probably not going to happen. And if that doesn't happen, and it doesn't come up again, I can imagine public support fading. It's a little bit like we saw in the year 2000 when I was doing public opinion research around the Camp David negotiations for a two-state solution and testing very sensitive, very controversial concessions, which before those negotiations began, there was a huge majority against certain concessions, like dividing Jerusalem. And the numbers began slowly and incrementally to rise, never reaching a huge majority, but very significantly rising, and then went back down. So we could see a similar situation here.
So it's always important to remember that public opinion is responsive. And one of the audience members actually asked in that regard, speaking of the kind of legitimization of Arab parties and Arab Knesset members, I'm asking for your hot take on this. Just yesterday, the members of the Joint List who made a different kind of oath, let's say, as they were sworn in at the Knesset. Do you think something like this is likely that specifically is going to impact Israeli public attitudes then toward the involving members of the Joint List or other Arab parties? I mean, this view that they are not committed to Israel, essentially disloyal. Has what happened yesterday in the Knesset made it harder now for Bennett or Lapid to form a government because it's going to, raise suspicions about the loyalty of our Knesset members?
I mean, the irony is, of course, it's made it harder. Of course, it's made it harder. It certainly didn't make it easier, But the irony is that it wouldn't have mattered. In other words, I really think that for one thing, the far right parties, it doesn't matter. There's nothing, those parties exist as Palestinian citizens of Israel. They are not legitimate for the religious Zionist party, not for Naftali Bennett, not for many Likud members, and probably not for Netanyahu. And well, I mean, Netanyahu is opportunistically considering it, but just all you have to do is look at what happened to number 7 on Labor's candidate list. Ibtisam Marana, a respected filmmaker and has been a politician in the past. They basically went on the rampage as soon as her candidacy was known, to dig up anything they could on her, and that's within the Labor Party, and to basically, slander her based on some tweets from like 7 years ago. So if that's the case, it wouldn't matter what the joint list did. They would not be legitimate. And I suppose, I'm not going to try to figure out what their thinking was because I wasn't involved with them. I did work on their campaign in the previous election cycle targeted at the Jewish voters, but I was not in touch with them on this. I don't know what their thinking was. My guess is that they were thinking, we have no chance anyway of getting into any government. We might as well make a statement, which has not been on the agenda, which is to push back against the presence of the Kahanists in government, to push back on the nation state law, to push back on the fact that we're looking at the most right-wing government in Israeli history, in Israeli history. My guess is that they thought, we are not going to be players in the government, so at least we'll make our statement. Of course, it made it harder for anybody on the center. But who are the centrists? Again, Yair Lapid was not in a position. He's not being called upon to form the government. He may be in the future, but I think that, I don't know, if he is in a position to form the next government, if Netanyahu fails and the mandate goes to Lapid, which is not a given at all. It might go to some sort of, triumvirate of Lapid and Bennett and Gideon Sa'ar, in which case it would never have been on the table to begin with. They're going to be spending, my guess is that Lapid and Bennett and Sa'ar are going to be spending the next 28 days hoping Netanyahu fails and trying to talk to somebody whose name we haven't mentioned, but we should, which is Moshe Gafni, who's the current leader of Torah Judaism, and trying to prize him away from the unshakable bond with Netanyahu, to try to get the ultra-Orthodox parties to peel away, as they have throughout Israel's history, to go with any government, including a change government, well before they would ever consider going with the joint list.
So we're almost out of time, but I feel it would be remiss if I didn't ask you for your predictions on how this is going to play out, because I'm sure everybody in the audience is wondering this. There's all sorts of scenarios, endless speculation about, whether Netanyahu will succeed in putting together a coalition. If he doesn't, whether somehow Bennett will become this unlikely prime minister, or whether there'll be a 5th election. What, from your vantage point and with your knowledge of Israeli politics, what do you think is likely to happen? Dare you say?
Well, of course, I mean, I have to say something. So as I managed to evasively say nothing because I'm practicing to be a politician. But I think that, before the election, when I had to kind of think about how to characterize it, this is not a formula-based, approach. It's more of a broad strokes approach that I said to myself, okay, and it's not just to myself, I said it to anybody who would listen to me, 40% chance Netanyahu forms the next government, 30% chance there's a change coalition, 30% chance of new elections. That was before the election, okay? And I keep thinking, should I revise that? Do I need to, update that? Is there any difference in my thinking on that? And I have to say that I think where we are now, remember, 40% is not 90%. So I still think 40% chance Netanyahu does form the next coalition. I mean, all he needs are a couple of defectors and to, offer Naftali Bennett the Justice Ministry, which is what Naftali Bennett wants, and 10 other ministries, which his 7-seat party will demand, and a few defectors, and he's got it, So I still give him 40%. And then the question is, do I have a rotation between my two 30% options? Is a 5th election more likely than a change coalition? I'm not sure, maybe, but there is a possibility still of a change coalition, to use Lapid's copywriting. It will be a spit and chewing gum kind of Rube Goldfarb contraption, something we used to say. And I think that it will be cobbled together as a temporary government until they can get more seats, maybe from the ultra-Orthodox parties, I don't even know exactly who the they are. The irony is that, and this is a supreme irony, which I think the left, my colleagues on the left wing in Israel are hotly debating right now to what extent they should support a party like Ra'am being the kingmaker, either in a right wing or a change coalition, given that Ra'am is an illiberal, theocratic, ultra-conservative religious party representing the Islamic movement. I mean, that doesn't reflect anything that counts as left-wing values, and it's not going to do a service to the cause of equality in Israel when it comes to, imposing religious standards on society. I've thought the great irony was that the first time a party representing Arab Palestinian citizens goes into government, it could enable the most, Jewish supremacist, anti-democratic, proto-fascist government, and I say that very advisedly because it includes the religious Zionists. If that were to happen, it would be a supreme irony, but it won't happen because the religious Zionists thought they weren't good enough for them. And the point is, it's hard to know exactly who would be in such a change coalition, but I suppose it's not impossible. We're all awaiting bizarre and unpredicted things that could happen to form such a government. And I could still see it happening. I just don't know which is in the first or the second place for the 30% slot of fifth election or a change coalition. So it's hard for me to be really specific.
Well, I think one thing is we can safely say, which is that the volatility and turbulence of Israeli politics, which Israel is famous for, is likely to continue. And as it does, we'll hopefully be able to call upon you, Dahlia, for your expertise to explain this to all of us. I want to thank you for sharing your wisdom, your insights, and all of our audience members for joining us. I want to encourage those in the audience to come to our next webinar, which is going to be on the 15th of April, when renowned Israeli historian Tom Segev will be talking about his biography of David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, who knew a thing or two about politics as well. So hopefully you can all join us for that event. I want to thank you, Dahlia, again for a wonderful presentation, great insights into what is a fascinating and Byzantine situation in Israel. Thank you all for joining us, and goodbye.
Thank you for hosting me.